Continuing our study here together, Luke chapter 8, the end of Luke chapter 8 in particular. So we continue looking at the study together. We'll be finishing up chapter 8. We actually kind of began looking at the ending of chapter 8 last week. We looked at kind of the interesting scenario where we had an event take place inside of an event. Typically when we're going through the book of Luke, we've seen singular events taking place in succession. Obviously these still take place in succession, but we see Christ almost getting sidetracked in a way. We'll get to that in a little bit. But we saw that, in particular last week, we looked at the woman being healed, the desperate woman being healed. We looked at some lessons that we can learn from us. So to kind of recap that, so it doesn't feel like we have that big gap in the middle of the passage that we're just not touching, we see that there was a woman that is introduced for us. We don't have a name given for us, just a woman. And she is a woman who has been sick. And she's been sick for some time. She has a disease in which she had a continuous flow of blood for 12 years. So this was a big issue, particularly in that day and culture, beyond just being inconvenient and uncomfortable. In the culture, in the law, according to the law of the Jews, dealing with blood in any way would make one unclean. So this consistent and constant issue of blood meant that for those 12 years that this woman was unclean without the ability to be cleansed and to become clean. And because of this, and because of the principle that one who was unclean can make a clean person unclean, she was essentially made an outcast. She was an outcast within society because of her disease, so her friends and family had abandoned her because they didn't want to be made unclean. She had nothing else. She had spent all that she had trying to be healed, so she has nothing. She is poor, she is needy, she has no other option, no other hope. But even though it may appear that she has no option, she actually does have hope. And she has hope because she has faith. Because we see that she showed great faith in Jesus and his ability to heal. And this ability to heal caused, and the faith that she had stirred her to action. As Jesus had returned from healing or casting out the demons out of the man who returns to this area, he is being pressed on all sides by people. You can get the idea that the people are swarming him. He is trying to weave his way through, people constantly touching him because of the popularity that he has. And as Jesus is being pressed by these crowds, we see that she slips through the people and kind of makes her way through all the people and is able to get to Jesus just close enough to be able to touch the hem of his garment. When she touches the hem of his garment, she is immediately healed, completely healed, at the moment of touching his garment. Now Jesus knows all of this is taking place. Jesus knows who touched him, but we see that he questions. And he questions primarily to test her faith. And we see Peter, one of the first instances where Peter kind of puts his foot in his mouth, because Jesus asks, well, who touched me? And Peter almost sarcastically says, what do you mean, who touched me? Or touched you? You're surrounded by people. Everybody's touching you. Who hasn't touched you? But Jesus is making the point of saying there is power that has left my body. Somebody touched me who wasn't. Jesus is doing this to try to, again, confirm and point to this woman's faith. This woman confesses that it was her, and Jesus says that because of your faith, you have been healed. So we see this miraculous event take place where Jesus heals this woman who has been sick with this disease, the flow of blood for that time. But remember, he was in the process of doing something else. And that is what we're going to be looking at this morning. We're going to be looking at the original purpose in which Jesus was moving through these crowds in the first place. So this morning we're going to seek to conclude the event, and we're going to, well, we were introduced to him last week, we'll be reintroduced this week to Jairus. morning we're going to be looking at 3 attitudes of Jairus. 3 attitudes that Jairus had during this sequence. So with your Bibles open to Luke chapter 8, we'll begin reading in verse 40, and we will read probably to verse 41, just these first 2 verses for our first. It says, "And it came to pass that when Jesus was returned, the people gladly received him, and they were all waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was a ruler of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and besought him that he would come into his house." Let's read 42, because we'll get to it at another point as well. But for he had only one daughter, about 12 years of age, and she lay dying. But as he went, the people thronged him. So that completes our sentence from 41 and 42. We talked about it last week, but it's worth repeating that after Jesus healed the demon-possessed man, the people that were in this area asked him to leave. They were fearful of Jesus. They were fearful of what he could do and the power that he had over the demons that he cast out. So as soon as he basically got there, he healed that man and he was asked to leave. So Jesus returns, he gets back in the boat, he sails to the Sea of Galilee, continues to go back. And when he returns, there is a huge crowd waiting for him. Now, again, understand the times. It's not like today where Jesus was posting updates on his social media of where he was going to be. The people had no idea where Jesus was. They had no idea where he was going. They had no idea when he was returning. So this gives you the level of the fanfare in which Jesus had. The people were just waiting. They didn't know when he was going to return. He didn't know where he was going. They didn't even know if he was going to come back to that particular city. But the people were waiting. They were anticipating Jesus. So he returns to this area that he had just previously ministered, and the crowds were waiting. And the crowds were bigger than they had ever been. But there was one man who was waiting that may have had a little bit more, maybe a little more distinguished than the rest. That was because of his prestige. This is Jairus. We mentioned that Jairus was the ruler of the synagogue. Now, the ruler of the synagogue in smaller cities would have been, at least in the minds of the Jewish people, probably one of the more prominent, important, popular figures. This would be kind of like the equivalent of showing up to a state within the United States and the governor being there ready to greet you. Or maybe you go to a prestigious college and the president of the college is waiting for you to take you on a tour. Maybe you're going to a company, a huge Fortune 500 company, and the CEO is ready to greet you and to take you out to lunch and do whatever you're set out to do. This is essentially who Jairus was. He was that prominent of a figure. He was that prominent of a figure, and he was well known, he was well respected, and he was an important man. But we see that he is going to show great humility, which is our first attitude this morning. Our first attitude is that of humility. Again, we've set the stage of who Jairus is. He's popular. He's important. He's the ruler of the synagogue. He's waiting for Jesus. But as Jesus approaches Jairus, we see that Jairus isn't showing an attitude of pride, which many people in his position could have, and probably would have. Right? Jairus could have made it so that he was the first one that saw Jesus. He would have been the first person sitting at the dock, waiting for his boat to return, taking Jesus' luggage and taking it for him, or having maybe someone else take it for him. He could have made it so that he didn't even have to wait. He could have had a group of people say, okay, when Jesus comes, you grab him and have him come directly to me. And he didn't have to wait there waiting for Jesus. But we see that this was not the case. He was waiting for Jesus. But why was he waiting for Jesus? Well, because 42 reveals for us that he only had one daughter. A 12-year-old daughter, and this daughter was dying. actively dying, sick to the point of death. Not that she was just sick with a cold, but she was sick to the point of death. And understand that her death could be upon her at any moment. Jairus was probably anxiously and eagerly awaiting Jesus' return. With every moment that passed, the fear in his head probably grew. Is she still alive? Will she make it? Is Jesus going to be here? And to Jairus' point, to his mind at this time, his daughter is still alive. And he sees Jesus approach. And we see his humility at full display. Because as he sees Jesus approach, he falls down at Jesus' feet. And as he falls down at Jesus' feet, he begs Jesus to come and to heal his daughter. He besought him that he would come into his house. He's waiting. He throws himself at Jesus' feet. I can almost imagine him weeping at Jesus' feet, begging him, please come to my house. Please come to my house. My daughter, my only daughter, she is sick. She's about to die. Please come and heal her. And as we look at this, we see what caused his humility. Really, for what most people cause their humility. That's desperation. He was desperate. There were no more other options. She was about to die, and he went to the only person that he could know that could help. Because again, if Jairus' daughter wasn't almost dead, I'm sure he wouldn't have dove at Jesus' feet. He probably wouldn't have even been there if she wasn't this sick. His desperation drove his faith and drove his humility. He was so desperate to have his daughter healed. He was so desperate to find Jesus that his only response to seeing him was to go to his feet and to beg him for help. Now, how does this apply to our humility? When we look at our humility before God, we should also be approaching him from a point of desperation. And we should be throwing ourselves at his feet just as Jairus threw his fellow Jesus. Now, the issue is, we as human beings are incredibly prideful. Humility is not a natural trait that resides within the sinful heart of man. Which is why desperation leads us to humility. Because we ought to be desperate for God. We ought to be desperate for his forgiveness. And as we are desperate for his forgiveness, we show humility in seeking that forgiveness. We ought to be desperate for his grace, desperate for his mercy, desperate for his presence, for his help, for his goodness, for his protection. That we take the importance off ourselves, the ability to do things off of ourselves, and show humility and place them at God's feet. We must have humility, like Jairus had. The second attitude that we see Jairus show is that of patience. That of patience. And this is where we start to blend together with the events, and we really need to keep in mind the events of the woman being healed as we think about the timeline here and the patience that Jairus shows. As Jairus had humbly pleaded with Jesus, we see that Jesus heeds Jairus' plea. Verse 43 starts the account of the woman, but at the end of verse 42, we see that he goes, and as he goes, the people throng. 43 through 51, or through 50, rather, shows the healing of the woman. Verse 51, we pick up, it says, when he came into the house, he suffered no man to go in. Skip over a verse, it's important. 51 does cover the case of Jairus. Rather, verse 49, while he yet spake, there cometh one from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, thy daughter is dead, trouble not the master. So some time has passed. all the events, as all these events take place with the woman, these weren't quick. I think sometimes we think the event is as quick as it is as we read it. It wasn't just a 5-minute interruption, but rather it could have been an hour, it could have been several hours that Jesus took healing this woman and the interaction that goes on. This means that there is this gap that Jairus is waiting. Jairus is waiting for Jesus to go and heal his daughter. Again, his daughter is at the point of death at any moment. Any moment she could be dead. For all Jairus knows, she could already be dead. But he shows patience. Probably most of us wouldn't have showed that level of patience. I know that if that was Jackson, I wouldn't have showed that level of patience. I would have been pulling on Jesus' arms. I would have almost been dragging him through the crowds, rushing him to finish talking with his disciples, rushing him to finish talking to this woman. Maybe telling him, ignore the woman who touched you, forget that woman, come on, we have a job to do, we gotta go heal. Maybe even ridiculed the interrogation of people like Peter. Jairus doesn't do any of that. Jairus patiently waits. He waits for Jesus to wait through the crowds. He waits for Jesus to heal this woman. He continues to move forward. And he waits so long that not only does his daughter pass away, but there's enough time that his daughter passes away and a messenger is able to come tell Jairus, don't worry about getting the master. Don't worry about getting Jesus. She's dead. Too late. She's gone. Messenger comes. And we can imagine that Jairus is probably full of hurt, full of pain, full of questions. He was probably playing through all the scenarios of what if in his head. What if Jesus would have come a little sooner? What if I would have pulled him through the crowds? What if I didn't spend so much time begging at his feet? What if he didn't have to heal this woman? What if? What if? What if? Now, in all reality, rushing probably wouldn't have made a difference, as his daughter probably would have been dead by the time he first met Jesus. But I think there's an important lesson that Jesus is teaching that we need to hear as well. And that lesson is that God has purposes, and God has plans, and God has schedules for those plans and those purposes. And at times, our plans and the timing of our plans don't always match God's. And we can have potentially different attitudes. We could show an attitude of frustration. Frustrated that God isn't doing things as quickly as we want him to. Or maybe frustrated that God's doing things too quickly and we're not ready for it. Could have an attitude of anger. God, why are you doing this? Why are you making me do this? Why aren't you doing this? We could have an attitude of doubt. I don't know why. There's questions of why. But as we see in this story, or will see in this story, and as we see in our lives, the attitude that we ought to have is an attitude of patience, an attitude of faith. We are to be patient for what God can and will do. Because many times, if we are patient and wait upon the Lord, what he does is more wondrous than we would have initially thought it was going to do. And we'll probably see that in the case of the story as well. And many times in our lives, if we wait on the Lord, we wait patiently for him, even though we may be tempted to be frustrated, we may be tempted to doubt, we may be tempted to be angry, we must set aside those temptations and faith, and trust, and be patient, because the Lord has a plan. And his plan is what is right and what is good. So at times we may think to ourselves, God, why not? Or God, why not? We may even ask him almost accusatory. In those moments we need to remember that God may be saying to us, why not? Or wait and see what I have for you. This leads us to our third attitude. That is an attitude of faith. An attitude of faith. We look back at the passage, verse 49. While he yet spake, there cometh one from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, Thy daughter is dead, trouble not the master. But when Jesus heard it, he answered him, saying, Fear not, believe only, and she shall be made whole. And when he came into the house, he suffered no man to go in, save Peter, and James, and John, and the father and the mother of the maiden. And all wept, and bewailed him. But he said, Weep not, she's not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed to scorn, knowing that she was dead. And he put them all out, and took her by the hand, and called her, saying, Maid, arise. And her spirit came again, and she arose straightway. And he commanded to give her meat. And her parents were astonished. But he charged them that they should tell no man what was done. Almost immediately as Jairus gets word that his daughter has passed away, Jesus swoops in to assure Jairus. Almost as if before Jairus could even get angry, before despair could fully set in, Jesus steps in. Right there's some immediate application for us. How often do we find that true in our lives? That in many times of deep moments of anger or despair or anguish, we find Jesus swooping into a way that calms us. When we need it most, it seems like Jesus comes with exactly what we need. Jesus says to Jairus, Do not be afraid. Only believe and she will be made well. Jairus, don't worry. The faith that brought you to me is the same faith that can make her well. This is a direct test to Jairus' faith. He had faith to go to find Jesus to heal his daughter. And now we will see the true strength of his faith. Because she's dead, and his faith is what's going to enable her to be healed. In many ways, this is similar to the woman who was healed. Her faith not only led to her going and seeking Jesus, but also what enabled her healing. For Jairus, his faith enabled him to go and seek Jesus, and his faith would determine whether or not his daughter would be healed. And we see that Jairus was willing to believe and show his faith. He could have very easily told Jesus, Jesus, just don't worry about it. She's dead. It's over. He could have even ridiculed Jesus. What do you mean, believe? Jesus, get out of here. She's gone. If you didn't take so much time healing that woman, she may have had a chance, but she's dead. It could have been really easy for Jairus in this moment to hurt and despair to doubt, to turn away, to deconstruct his faith. But he remains firm in his faith, even in the midst of the most difficult moment of his life, where he may have the most confusion that he's ever had, where he may be suffering a pain that no parent ever wants to suffer. Something interesting happens. As they are entering the house, there are mourners there, which means that in the Jewish culture, she is as dead as dead can get. When the mourners are called in, it means that she is confirmed dead, and they actually had professional mourners that would come to mourn the dead. These mourners are here, they are crying, they are mourning. And Jesus tells them, don't mourn. She's not dead, she's just asleep. And they laugh at Jesus. They scorn Jesus for saying this. imagine that. The one who actually has the power to heal you laugh after saying that she's not actually pregnant. We see that Jesus ignores that. He doesn't address that. He calmly takes Peter, James, John, kind of identifying 3 core disciples, 3 core teachers, like that. Takes Peter, James, John, takes Jairus, Jairus' wife in the group, the deceased girl. The people that are in there mourning, he clears them out, tells them to leave. So it's this girl, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, Jairus and his wife. Jesus takes the hand of the girl and says, "May it arise." And we see that her spirit returns to her. She was truly dead. Her spirit was gone. But because of Jesus' power, because of Jesus' command, telling her to arise, her spirit returns. And she immediately rose. Jairus' faith has been tested. His daughter has been brought back from the dead. Jesus commands the girl to eat. And this was to prove that she was indeed back from the dead and was physically alive, not just some kind of spirit or some kind of hallucination. And both Jairus and his wife were astonished. Remember how I said that oftentimes when we wait for God, He does things in a way that is better than we even imagine. This is how I imagine Jairus thinking. He probably was seeking Jesus to come and heal his daughter, and that she would be on the road to recovery. That he would meet her and greet her and heal her, and she would start to get better. And she would slowly start to strengthen. That over the span of days, maybe weeks, and even months, she would return to full health. And Jairus probably would have gladly taken it. I would have gladly taken that if I was in his shoes. We see because he waited, because he had faith, that she was fully restored, as if she had never been sick, fully back from the dead, eating, alive, and they're astonished. They had faith, but still could not believe in how Jesus worked. That happens to us in our lives as well. How often do we have faith that God can do something, but that when we see Him actually do it, we are still blown away by how He does it? It should lead to our praise and admiration. Now we see a very particular request, an almost peculiar request on the part of Jesus, and one that's different than some of His other moments of ministry. He asks Jairus and his wife to not share what happened. Don't tell others what happened. Almost in every other scenario, Jesus wants the people to be a witness for Him. But here, He doesn't. And I think it's for good reason. Jesus is beginning to continue to shift His ministry into a particular way. And eventually the crowds are going to turn on Jesus. Now imagine that word got out that Jesus could heal people from the dead, and they were as fully gone as they were. Could you imagine how much greater the crowds would be? Knowing that He could raise people from the dead? Knowing that there wasn't a limit to raising people from the dead? You would have people coming and saying, "Can you raise my father and mother from the dead that died 10 years ago?" Everyone would be coming to Jesus asking for relatives, friends, raised from the dead in addition to everything else. Jesus didn't need or want that attention at this point in His ministry because it was going to detract from His mission and purposes in the Son. So He tells them, don't tell them. Don't tell them. And they heeded this. And this will transition us into chapter 9 where Jesus sends His disciples out. But as we conclude this morning, we've witnessed another incredible miracle by Jesus. Yet another great example of faith. And this example of faith leaves us with some questions about ourselves and about our faith. First, do we have humility in our lives? As I said before, the natural position of man is that of God. We think that we don't need help, and that we don't want help until it gets so bad that we reluctantly say with no other option, fine, I'll take it. We need to understand our state. We need to understand our desperation. And understand that from the beginning. And if we understand who we are, and our desperate state in light of life, and who we are in light of God, this will enable us to have humility, to turn to God for help. Not when things get so far out of hand that we can't take it, from the very beginning to where we don't get to the point of stress. Turn to God with a humble act. Second, are we patient with God? Almost sounds ridiculous of a question to ask if we are patient with God. But we so often find ourselves rushing God. Or asking God to push things away. Waiting can be the hardest thing. But when it comes to God, we know that if He chooses to have us wait, it's for a good reason. It's for our blessing. And our blessing will be greater than we could have initially thought if we truly waited upon Him. Third, do we continue to show faith even in the difficult moments of life? It is far easier to show faith when things are going well. But when we are hurt, when we are in despair, when we are desperate, struggling, confused, how is our faith at? This is when we need our faith most. Don't question God during those moments. Instead of questioning God, try to get as close to Him as you can. And as you draw close to God, see the wonderful things that He will do. Father, I thank you for this account of faith that was shown, the attitudes that were shown. Lord, help us in our lives to have an attitude of humility. Help us to have an attitude of patience. Lord, help us to have an attitude of faith. That we may please you in our lives, not just the easy things, but all.